Latin America overcomes fears of conflict with hugs and handshakes. But was the crisis really about a border raid? And is it really over? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Sami Zeidan. Well, it was a confrontation some feared might lead to war. A Colombian raid into Ecuadorian territory left it at odds with a raft of Latin American nations. And it took pleas at a summit meeting in the Dominican Republic and intervention from several in the region to diffuse the tension. But what happens now? Handshakes end Latin America's worst diplomatic crisis in years. Televised live across the continent, Colombia's president makes up with his counterparts from Ecuador and Venezuela. The rift began here when Colombia staged a cross-border bombing raid in Ecuador. The target, guerrillas from Marxist group Farc. Farc's killed thousands of Colombians over 40 years and holds hundreds of people hostage. At this camp, more than 20 rebels died, including the outfit's number 2. It sparked a week of crisis across Latin America. Leftist allies Venezuela and Nicaragua joined Ecuador in cutting diplomatic ties with US-backed Colombia. But much was at stake, not least Colombia and Venezuela's $5 billion of bilateral trade. So a grudging apology from Colombian President Alvaro Uribe has now diffused the standoff, though restoring full diplomatic relations may take some time. Well, joining our discussion today, our guests in Washington, D.C., Ray Walzer, Senior Policy Analyst for Latin America at the Heritage Foundation. In London, Colin Harding, former Latin America editor at the Independent newspaper. And on the phone from Caracas, Fred Fuentes, an aide to a senior Chavez advisor and fellow at the Miranda International Center. Thank you all for being with us. If I could actually start with Fred, is the crisis over or simply back on sleep mode? What do you think?
Well, I think for now, given the resolution that has come out of the meeting that occurred yesterday and the day before, what we're seeing is a relative calm that has reappeared once again with a very strong resolution that has made clear the opposition of all the governments here in Latin America to any cross-border raids, to any violation of each country's national sovereignty. And that's been an important step forward that has been taken to diffuse these tensions. Although I think we can't expect that the tensions will stay low forever, as there's a continuing issue of this humanitarian exchange in Colombia, where the internal conflict continues to fire up.
All right, we can't expect that the tensions will stay low forever, the words of Fred Fuentes. I want to go over to Colin Harding and ask the question, could war re-emerge? Was the region really on the verge of war to start off with?
No, I don't think so, really. I think Uribe took a calculated gamble in taking out Raúl Reyes, the Farc second in command just across the border in Ecuador. He knew there would be a tremendous outcry about it, but I think he wanted to send a message to his neighbouring countries that this is the sort of thing Colombia can do. As far as President Hugo Chavez was concerned, he interpreted the action as a warning, indeed, from Colombia, that this is the sort of thing they could do. And he made a great issue of it and threatened war because he wanted to prevent the principle that Colombia is entitled to launch cross-border raids when it feels like it. He wanted that stopped. I mean, this is the notion of the surgical strike which Israel has used and which the United States has used, indeed.
So the dispatch of tanks by Chavez, tanks and troops to the border, what, just muscle flexing?
Well, it was to show that Venezuela is capable both of responding and also of mustering a lot of opposition to Colombia. It was an attempt to put pressure on Colombia and also to isolate Colombia by assembling this group of other countries to condemn Colombia's action.
All right.
But I don't think...
All right, sorry, I want to bring in Ray Walzer from the Heritage Foundation. Why did things not only heat up so quickly, but cool down so quickly?
Well, I think clearly heated up very quickly because of the, as my colleague in London said, because of the cross-border incursion, because of the rather quick surgical strike against Raul Reyes, and the Farc encampment, which was a fairly sophisticated base of operations. They had settled in there for a fairly long period of time. It wasn't as if they had just crossed over the border. So it also, another factor appears to be the intelligence information gathered from the computers. There's a lot of stuff that they're continuing to mine on this, and I don't think it's going to look very good either to Ecuador or to Venezuela. So another reason for trying to reach some sort of closure on this particular event was the potential for continuing revelations coming out of the materials.
So you're suggesting, you're suggesting that perhaps Hugo Chavez didn't want this to escalate because he's worried about allegations made about material found on laptops?
Well, I think there is some concern on the part, particularly the interconnections. And again, the proof there is one, it has been now held by the Colombians, so there's a good plausibility, or it will not carry quite the same sort of weight that it would if it were seized by an independent authority. I understand that Interpol is going to look at this. But I think that there have been a pattern of, for the last 4 or 5 years, a pattern of increasing interaction between the Farc and the Venezuelan government, between Chavez and the Farc. So probably a good time to ramp this crisis down.
Well, let's bring in Fred Fuentes once again. Was the crisis simply about a border raid, or was it also about ideological struggles?
I think it was more than just the border raid, and I think an important aspect to take into consideration is the timing of this attack, because we have information that has been coming out here in the Venezuelan press that the Colombian government and Colombian military had the coordinates for Raul Reyes, some say now up to for the last 2 years. But the timing of this attack was very clearly calculated. Firstly, to occur only several days after the latest release of prisoners by the Farc, in order to undermine the whole peace process that has been led both by Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez as well as Colombian Senator Piedad Córdoba. But I think another important aspect, and why I think the resolution of the Group of Rio was so important, was that this attack came only a few days before UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations, was meant to meet in Bogota. Of course, after this attack and this violation of national sovereignty of Ecuador, it was impossible for this meeting to have occurred. And I think a very important aspect of both Washington's policies and how it's been applied by Colombia is to break up, to fragment this process of regional integration that is occurring across the continent. Now, that attempt to stop this convergence of Latin American governments was impeded. To a certain extent, UNASUR was not able to meet, but at the same time, the Group of Rio was able to meet and to discuss with all the heads of Latin American states. I believe only Brazil didn't have president. And
wait, sorry, Fred, hang on just a second. If I could just jump in there, Fred. If I get you right, what you're saying is that Colombia deliberately targeted the rebel leader Reyes at a time when he's in Ecuador to try and disrupt Latin America unity efforts by Hugo Chavez, correct?
Well, I think that, and to begin a pretext to justify its idea of preventative war, because they could have carried out this attack on Colombian soil. They've had the coordinates for Raul Reyes over 2 years. He has been in Colombian territory. They also claim he has been in Venezuelan territory. But I think they specifically chose to target this when he was in Ecuadorian territory to sort of push the boundary a bit, to see how far they could go with these attacks and see what the response would be amongst Latin America, where obviously different governments have different opinions as to the policies of the Colombian government and also the Farc as well.
All right, let's take that point back to Ray Walzer. It's a sentiment you often hear from countries in Latin America, perhaps the U.S. using its allies like Colombia to try and get back at Hugo Chavez and his agenda.
Well, I would strongly disagree with Mr. Fuentes. Now, in terms of the military operation, had they had the coordinates, I cannot address that particular issue. Apparently, it was a combination of information from informants plus his use of his satellite phone that gave him away from this particular base. Now, where they had been tracking him, where he was in the past 2 years, I don't have the information to comment. Secondly, as an effort I think it does complicate the humanitarian exchange. I don't think that there is at this particular point a peace process at work in Colombia. My understanding that that largely broke down in 2002. What there is a process of efforts, laudable efforts, to arrange a humanitarian exchange, to have the release of the 45 or so hostages from the political hostages from the Farc. To break up unity in sort of leftist unity, I don't think that was, I didn't even know, I was not aware that there was an UNISOR. It's not I am aware of ALBA and some of the other Venezuelan-led projects. I was not aware of this particular meeting. I don't think that that was, at least from my point of view, would be high on the Colombian agenda. They are in a desperate struggle with the Farc. Uribe enjoys great popular support against the Farc. He saw an opportunity to strike. He has taken a diplomatic hit, and there will be continuing fallout from this, particularly in the humanitarian side. But I don't think it's a gesture designed to disrupt unity. Right. If anything, it has unified the Latin Americans against Colombia. So I don't think that's
a really interesting point, which actually I wanted to pick up with Colin. In a sense, would you agree with those who say that perhaps at the end of the day, Hugo Chavez can claim some kind of victory here because, as has just been said, it's Colombia and its allies, or the US and its allies, namely Colombia, which are left isolated?
Up to a point, yes. I mean, Fidel Castro wrote a piece in the Cuban newspaper yesterday proclaiming this was a knockout blow to US imperialism and to Colombia, who, of course, Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez regard as a US client state. The Colombians have been condemned for the cross-border raid. I think that was in Uribe's calculations when he decided to launch it. But the condemnation of Colombia that was demanded, particularly by President Correa of Ecuador, wasn't forthcoming. And the resolution in Santo Domingo also included an appeal to Latin American countries not to give succor to, not to give safe haven to insurgents trying to overthrow legitimately elected governments. So it wasn't a complete triumph. It could also be argued that Uribe achieved most of what he wanted. And I think the timing of the raid, which was mentioned earlier, I think the most important factor there was the release of the 4 hostages just a few days earlier, which, of course, it was part of Farc's campaign to achieve international legitimacy, recognition as belligerents in effectively a civil war. And Hugo Chavez has been appealing for this as well and used the release of the latest hostages as a reason for stopping regarding Farc as terrorists and regarding them as legitimate combatants. That is obviously a very negative development as far as President Uribe is concerned, and I think that the launch of the raid was very much designed to nip that in the bud.
All right, Fred Fuentes, how do you respond to those who say that Hugo Chavez's support for Farc is simply perhaps a gimmick to deflect domestic attention away from domestic problems?
Look, I think that's been said a lot, particularly by the opposition press here in Venezuela. But if we put this in the context, we have a situation where there is an internal conflict that has been raging for some almost 5 decades now in Colombia, that has several times threatened to spill over the border, and in fact has had incidents, because we should recall that this is not the first time in recent years that Colombia has violated the national sovereignty of a neighbour country. The recent one was obviously the bombing in Ecuador, but it was in late 2005 that it was that Colombian secret military also captured a Farc leader in Venezuela, although claiming they had done so in Colombian territory. The evidence obviously then came out that they had violated Venezuelan sovereignty in order to carry out this kidnapping and this arrest. So this is a dangerous situation, and in order for there to be real peace in Venezuela, there's a necessity to find a way towards some political accord in Colombia, particularly in the context where some 4 million Colombians currently reside in Venezuela. So these issues are dramatically intertwined, and certainly there are no differentiation on this issue between domestic and international politics.
Well, we'll have to ask our guests to stay with us for a moment because it is time for a short break now. But when we come back, we ask, what exactly do Farc want? And after military setbacks, how likely is it they'll actually achieve it? Stay with us.